We are studying Sri Aurobindo's description of the conflict or division between soul and nature and their resolution and unification. This, you will recall, is in the context of a much larger discussion in which he has described how it is possible to rise straight in a concentrated movement to recover the oneness in the divine consciousness, to be able to live in that Satchidananda and oneness in the midst of all activities of all life. But then there is still the question of a practical division between the parts of our nature which do not experience that oneness and the parts or the levels of our higher consciousness which live in the oneness. How are we to heal this division? And the whole current and rest of the chapters describe a process which is top down, in which reality is as if stitched back. What was earlier separated and divided is now woven back, and the underlying oneness recovered top down. From our highest poise of consciousness in which we may live in it, all the way down to the most material parts where we may experience and live in it now entirely. It is such a integral realization of oneness that Sri Aurobindo leads us to. But for this purpose, he has to show how this oneness exists even in the midst of what appears to us to be an unavoidable duality. He takes up this question of the Purusha and Prakriti as the two principles which play such a significant role, because we find this duality existing at every level. Wherever there is something which is expressed and the consciousness expressing, you have the duality. Because the consciousness which is expressing and the expression itself are so fundamentally different. One is unchanging, unmoving in itself. The other exists because of movement. If movement stopped, there would be nothing. And so they are literally polar opposites in terms of what we experience of them. There's a brief description of various approaches to the resolution of these two, and they always leave something missing. We may say, for example, that the movement is illusory, but then the reality is that even in the deepest of meditations, when you live in oneness, a knock on the body will still remind you and draw you out of something which exists, which is not in that oneness. And so we move now towards this integral resolution of this division, and he deliberately brings the focus not to a philosophical solution but an experiential one, and it is through an experience that we can bring these two together in the yoga. He places the problem succinctly. What are we to do with these two which are facing each other? Nature, on both a personal level and in a cosmic activity, is trying to impress itself upon the soul to possess, control, determine it. And this is the experience we have. The whole world is as if set up, in the extreme we may say, against us. And everything that happens in the world is somehow trying to creep into your personal life, into your thoughts, into your emotions, even into your body. And it gets in as if in order to get a hook into you, and then to somehow try to sway you and compel you into its activity. So we find, for example, our thoughts are always influenced by what we read, what people tell us. And even if we sit in isolation from not reading, or listening, the thoughts still enter in the universal mind. Your neighbor's thoughts enter into your head and influence you. Most people are so unconscious of it. We do not realize, especially in large cities, when you live in little flats piled up on top of each other, next to each other, you think you're living in your own personal free space, and as you go to sleep in your bedroom, your head is generally towards the wall. You don't realize exactly 2 or 3 feet behind that wall is another person lying down, and all his thoughts, all his feelings, all that's happening there is just 3 feet away. And it obviously penetrates into your aura and influences you. We're just not conscious of it. We do not realize that all the hundreds of beings in that big building, or the millions of people in the big city, are all creating this cloud of thoughts and emotions which are penetrating and shaping us from inside. And all of this would be part of the larger nature entering into your personal space, impressing itself as if trying to possess and control and shape you. And this is on the larger scale. In our own individual case, we find you as a conscious person who wants, for example, to do good, finds himself somehow swayed by the limitation of your own nature. I want to do good, I want to be happy, I want to be of service, but I discover as I wake up from sleep, I feel somehow dull, I feel inertia, I'm unable to do my good, I'm unable to have a buoyant happiness, and somehow I get swayed by the state of my body or my nature, my character. I don't want to get angry, but when the provocation comes, I can't help it. I am carried away. Who is this I which cannot help? And what is its relationship with this thing which compels it to get angry even when it does not? And this is the conflict you're facing. Nature creeping and somehow compelling you to be what it wants rather than what you actually are or want to be. And on the other side, there is the soul, which feels that in some mysterious way it has a freedom. Although I get angry, I know that I am able to overcome my anger. I know that I should be able to be free of anger. How do you know that? Where does that knowledge come from? Is it even true? And you experience in yourself this sense of actually being able to be free of the anger, to be able to struggle against its impulse pushing on you, and for a while you are able to resist it, and then you get sucked into it. That momentary experience where you are able to resist it is a clear experience. It is a conviction of experience that you can be and are actually in that center free. And yet that freedom is somehow weak, fragile, or somehow can be invaded upon by this other thing which is not you. And so it feels first the sense of freedom, it feels a control over itself. I know that if I can somehow impose that sense of freedom, I can actually prevent this invasion. I can push it back. And again, this is validated by experience. And then it finds it has a responsibility for what it is and does. And therefore it tries to turn upon nature, its own nature and the world's nature, and it reverses the process and tries to control and possess its own nature and the world's nature, and even enjoy its nature and world nature. Or it tries to reject and escape. And this is the challenge before us. What are we to do with these two which are set face to face? The solution Sri Aurobindo offers begins with an important idea that in this relationship there are two components. One in which the soul finds itself compelled and bound by nature, and then one where it feels and knows itself free and able to even command nature. And he points out that these are actually two different relationships on two different levels of consciousness. At a lower level, we are literally a puppet, although separate from nature, but we are largely determined by nature, and we even feel ourselves formed by her. But in our higher status, in the status of the spirit, the soul is free. And from its freedom, it is able to influence nature and even override nature or completely reshape its relationship with nature. And we have to recognize now two different relationships at the same time, but on two different levels of consciousness. And so the satisfying and victorious solution to this problem is really one of being able to bridge these two different statuses and find the way by which we can rise from this to that while being here in the body, engaged in life. And he says, according to the nature of the relationship that we choose will be our solution for this problem. So first he has explained how as long as we are involved in mind, possessed by the ordinary phenomenon of mental thought, sensation, emotion, reception of the vital and physical impacts of the world, and the mechanical reactions to them, the soul is subject to nature. And this is where we are in the beginning of the yoga. And we have studied this in some detail. And if we had not somewhere within us this constant knowledge of our freedom, we would have just accepted that we are a product of nature, which is the conclusion of modern physical science. But uplifted into the spirit, the soul is no longer subject to nature. It is above this mental activity. Now, in the first point, when we are above the mental activity, there is a relationship of detachment, aloofness. And we will see later how this relationship can be modified through a series of steps until it becomes not only master but also enjoyer of nature. But at the first step, we must recognize the freedom that exists there. And then we will see small steps for the change. It may be above it in detachment and aloofness, udasina, seated above and indifferent, or attracted by and lost in the absorbing peace or bliss of its undifferentiated, its concentrated spiritual experience of itself. And this is what you will find in states of deep meditation, or even when we go into a space in nature which is conducive to this kind of detachment. And the most common of these is climbing at the top of a mountain. Somehow the sense of distance that we physically experience through the senses, where the cities are far away, the rest of the earth is far away, we are as if detached physically from the space of activity, gives to us either of these statuses, one of detachment and aloofness. You sit there and you're just content to be. Somehow all the problems of the world fade away, and it feels like you could be like this forever, and it wouldn't matter. Even in an extreme, the world could go into blazes, it wouldn't matter. You are at peace, content. And from this, a variation will be, as you enjoy this peace and contentment, you begin to absorb, concentrate yourself into it, until even the reality of the mountain and the world fades away. Not only it wouldn't matter, well, it doesn't even exist practically to you. You're so absorbed in the peace, contentment, or even in the blissfulness of this concentration. And so you can see why many yogis who choose to withdraw from the world would want to set up their physical station in such a place, because it helps precisely for this. And then Sri Aurobindo points out, We must then transcend by a complete renunciation of nature and cosmic existence, not conquer by divine and sovereign possession. This is what you would do. You would stand back and withdraw. There's no question of conquering or possessing. But there is another relationship possible. But the spirit, the divine, is not only above nature, it is master of nature and cosmos. The soul rising into its spiritual poise must at least be capable of the same mastery by its unity with the divine. So now we come to a different way of looking at it. If we may push this analogy that we have drawn a step further, it is from the top of the mountain that the rivers begin to flow from the glaciers that go and feed the plains. It is from the top that the seed of life itself flows to sprout and grow everywhere on earth. And if here you wield the source of the waters, from here you can also flow with the waters and nourish, actively participate and engage while still being seated at the source and fully engaged. If you could be one with the waters that flow from the top. And as an analogy, it gives us a hint of what the experience is like. It's as if you are stationed in this freedom, and yet from this freedom something pours out that fills as an energy, as a power, actively supporting, directing, guiding, and then by degrees it can even take charge and consciously wield. So the divine, which is above nature, is also master of nature. And if you choose to station yourself in that consciousness, you should be able to share in its mastery. It must be capable of controlling its own nature, not only in calm or by forcing it to repose, but with a sovereign control of its play and activity. So now we're beginning to look at small steps of experience which are often instinctively a part of our life, but we can consciously now bring into the larger yogic process. So here first the statement is logical. Yes, the divine should be able to. And therefore our consciousness, so detached, should be able to do this. But let's look at it practically. What does it mean? You are in a situation of life where you're challenged by problems, maybe even overwhelmed by problems. The first thing that happens within your nature personally is anxiety, tension, fear. If you feel overwhelmed, you push back somehow and panic, or push back with energy, with force of violence or anger, or some energy that is reacting to the pressure. The character of your nature is that it is primarily mechanical. The character of your consciousness, the Purusha, is that it is primarily from a poise, it acts from a poise of freedom. So the moment you see in you something happening automatically as a reaction, you know it's a part of your nature. You step back from it. First step. There's a reaction, I got upset. I got anxious. I begin to worry. And they're all instinctive, automatic, mechanical reactions in your mind, in your emotions, in your sensations. I step back from it. This is not me, not my choice, not the poise of my freedom. I can step back from the anxiety and observe the anxiety as happening in me or in my emotions, but I am not in the anxiety. I did not choose it. That separation is critical. Now, at first, a person may find it difficult, or this part of the part of a mind separating from the emotions will be your center. And then you have to separate from the mind's thoughts. But very quickly, with a little bit of practice, one can find somehow a state of separation in which you are not the anxiety. The anxiety is still there. And then you discover, Sri Aurobindo has used 3 phrases here. It must be capable of controlling its own nature, not only in calm or by forcing it to repose, but with a sovereign control. So these are 3 degrees. The first thing you do is observing that I am not this anxiety. There is an anxiety, there is a fear, there is a panic, there is a worry for the future, even a worry whether I will survive. But as long as I identify with the part which is in worry, I get into panic. When I separate from the part which is worrying and I observe the worry as not me, I discover I am free and in calm. What can I do? I can now impose this calm. Okay, cool down. You don't need to get excited. You don't need to get agitated. Breathe deeply, relax, de-stress yourself, and you bring your nature into a state of calm. The moment you have done that, as a first step in bringing to calm, you discover already now you are able to respond without reaction. Or at least the reactive part is now mostly out of the way. You can give a reasonable response. The mother, describing this process to children in the ashram, said that the best way when you find yourself angry, the best way, she said, put your hands in your pocket and count to 10. Now, why do you put your hands in your pocket? So that your hand does not go to give a knock straight away. That would be the instinctive reaction. Why do you count to 10? To give that moment for the mind and emotions to step back just enough that the impulse to anger ceases to exist. The character of anger is that it rushes forward, and if somehow you can avoid its expression for a few seconds, it loses force immediately. If you do not do that, then it goes wham, and of course, too late. You regret afterwards. So put your hands in your pocket, you have blocked the physical instinct, count to 10, you have blocked the emotional or mental instinct, and by the time you have counted to 10, maybe even by the time you have gone to 5, the impulse to anger is gone. Or it's sufficiently dimmed that you can now take control and do something different. A variation to this, not specific to anger, she advised, before you respond to anything, take a moment to step back and then act. Anything happens, step back, act. Now, what is happening when you step back? You step back from what? From yourself, from your own reactive parts. And the moment you have stepped back, you have come closer to the poise of the Purusha, the freedom which is innate. May not be completely, but whatever degree. And when you review, you realize half the time, well, you don't need to say anything. If you have to say something, what you were about to say was probably not the best thing to say. And from this moment of stepping back, your perspective changes, and maybe you may intervene, but with minimal requirement and maximum result. And this is a very useful exercise. If you combine the two, you will see when you get overwhelmed, you count to 10, hold back. But when you're not overwhelmed, well, you just do the same thing but step back. It's a minor variation of the same movement, which is putting your hand in your pocket and counting to 10. So the first practical thing which you are able to do is bring in this calm. And in the calm, the freedom of the soul is able to act more directly. The second phrase he has used, forcing it to repose. Now, in your nature, you are unable to bring calm because of the nature of the crisis. It's affecting you so deeply, it gets into your sleep. It raises your blood pressure, the stress levels are shooting up, and you are unable to bring this calm. And so the second degree of exercise is imposing, forcing it to repose, to come back to rest. And so the doctor prescribes you to take a holiday, to take a break, if at all you can free your mind from it, or to take medication, which is again an indirect mechanism to force your nature to come into a state of repose. You take sleeping pills, forces the body to go into repose. You take medication to calm your mind. Again, these are indirect methods. A direct process would be of the consciousness itself recognizing which part in me is agitated and then forcing it literally to become relaxed. There are many techniques used, including breathing, visualization, or tensing and relaxing muscles. One of the most powerful which you can use is based on the recognition that your physical body and your subtle body are joined. So anything happening in the subtle body has its effect in the physical. Anything happening in the physical has its effect on the subtle. So if that tension of your mind is causing a tension in your heart or stomach or constricts your capillaries to push up your blood pressure, you can also reverse the process. And the technique used for this is to tense the muscles, and then relax. Tense, relax. And do this a few times, part by part, starting with the toes, calves, and so on, all the way to the head, including even the face, and so on. If you follow a graded process, step by step, you will end up with a degree of relaxation which is far more than you could have done by simply trying to relax. In the act of tensing, you are bringing awareness into that part, which gives you greater control to be able to relax. And by causing a relaxation in the physical body, you are influencing the state of tension in the subtle body, in the thoughts and the emotions. And very quickly, everything can be brought to a compelling forcing to repose. Now, both of these represent an exercise of control, but these are a first step. What do we need to take it all the way to eventually from there? And that's the third phrase he has used. It must be capable of controlling its own nature, not only in calm or by forcing it to repose, but with a sovereign control of its play and activity. And what is this sovereign control? The true lordship is when, without needing to impose anything, freely flowing, you are able to control as if it is a part of yourself. It is yourself. It is a free expression of your consciousness. And this would, with nothing opposing, nothing resisting, nothing which is different from the free will that you exercise. Of its play and activity, everything should be simply flowing freely like this. This is the goal towards which he will be showing us the way. So this initial control is what we are capable of within a lower level. It is only from a spiritual poise that you can gain the higher control of the sovereign control. In the lower poise, this is not possible because the soul acts through the mind. And the mind can only act individually and fragmentarily in a contented obedience or a struggling subjection to that universal nature through which the divine knowledge and divine will are worked out in the cosmos. Now he's changing the perspective a little bit. Not only are we seeing our relationship with our nature, but he is putting it into context of a larger working. And we will see why this is important, because it will give us the next step that we can take to realign ourselves to the larger working in preparation for this true freedom. So in the lower poise, what's happening is the soul acts through the mind, and the mind has a problem. It can only act in my mind. It does not know the mind of everyone else. It does not know the cosmic mind. It can only act in its individual focus and fragmentarily. So the mind itself operates through pieces of viewpoints, opinions, tendencies or ideas which might be contradictory. At the moment this idea comes in front, I push forward, and then another idea comes up and I say, oh yeah, that's true, I push that, and I don't realize the two are contradictory. But well, that's the problem of working through the mind. And the mind acts fragmentarily in a contented obedience. It is the only way the mind knows that it thinks it is right, and so it obeys whatever impulse comes with it. Or struggling subjection. I want to do something different, but I'm unable to, and I find myself carried away by the pressure of circumstances. Now this is you're not even conscious when this happens. You're with a group of friends who have a very strong drive, a very strong opinion, and you find yourself somehow swayed by that. In the moment you say, yes, that makes sense. You go out of the group and say, but I would never have done that. The obedience and this resistance of struggling to pressure, these are the characteristics of a mind which is fragmented. What's the solution? To get into a consciousness which is wider, which is not fragmented, not subject to anything else, but which is itself master. And so this is the poise that we will be moving to, and he will show us how. And then he puts in the context. What is happening in the mind's subjection? It is working in part of a much larger universal nature. And in this nature, which is spread out as wide as the universe, there is above it something else which is working. The divine knowledge and the divine will are working through it to fulfill themselves in the cosmos. Now we have this individual struggling, part of the larger universal nature, which is itself subject to the divine will and the divine knowledge working through it. Let's briefly explore this top relationship of the divine knowledge and will working through universal nature. Look back at the Earth's development going back, let's say, a few billion years as we understand it, through our current knowledge of science and archaeology and biology. We see a progression, steps of evolution, bringing it all the way to where we are today as human beings. You do not see loops falling back. You do not see loops wandering. You see a very clear progression, always moving forward. You notice also, every time that a form of mammal or creature has been developed, and the development is complete, it continues to stay what it is now across. The crocodile, for example, is what it was 64 million years ago when the dinosaurs were made extinct. It has not evolved, at least not apparently biologically. And so it is for all beings. There is a process of pushing forward until it comes to a completion, and then it stays there. If all of evolution was driven purely by survival of the fittest or random mutations, etc., you cannot explain these two characteristics of the forward movement of evolution. The only explanation is there is an intelligence working through nature and through nature's chance processes. It knows when it wants to push something forward, it knows which direction is forward, it knows when to stop the development of the body form of the species and continue development of others. And it knows how to keep them all in balance with each other. Fascinating. It has to have a knowledge which spans across time, across a billion years of possibilities, across space, across the whole of the earth and perhaps across many planets, and knowing precisely what it needs to do to make just the right intervention to produce that outcome. You do not see in nature, for example, what may be described as pointless changes in the genome. Every change seems to prepare for something else, and something else that leads to an outcome. Nothing is ever wasted. So not only is there an extraordinary and minute intelligence on a universal scale, but there is a precision of power of action in the detail operating at a molecular structure in the genes, while still working on massive scales of supernovas and planetary formations. Amazing, isn't it? And this is that divine knowledge and divine will working through universal nature. Now within universal nature, as we can observe it, you do not see any conscious knowledge of why it's doing or what it will lead to. That is operating above universal nature, in the divine knowledge and will. And it is this level which is what we have described as spirit, where the soul rising to that level has the full freedom and mastery over nature. So, but the spirit is in possession of knowledge and will, of which it is the source and cause and not a subject. Therefore, in proportion as the soul assumes its divine or spiritual being, it assumes also control of the movements of its nature. So the first focus here is the change taking place in relationship with our own nature. As your consciousness grows and rises to that poise of spirit, which is the same level of the divine knowledge and divine will working on universal nature, when it reaches or as it approaches that consciousness, the first result is in your own processes, in your own nature. It assumes control of the movements of its nature. Now this is simply stated. It's not always obvious, especially when we look at the control over the body nature. Your consciousness rises, but what happens to your body? Does it change? It's more obvious in relation to the mind. As your consciousness rises, well, your mind becomes somehow clearer. Your mind becomes less prone to instinctive reactions because your awareness is clear and can imprint its clarity in the mind. And when the mind becomes more clear and calm and begins to reflect the freedom of the spirit, something else happens. It can influence its clarity onto your emotions. You see, when your mind is clouded, your emotions, of course, will lead. When your mind is clear, it can recognize the tendency of the emotions and can restrain them. And when your emotions themselves become very clear, and these are experiences we've all had in brief periods, when the emotions are clear, we find they are not so reactive. And they can express more truly what we feel. Why cannot this process go all the way down to the physical body? It's not obvious within our experience because we have not yet reached a status of freedom of spirit which is able to influence the mind and emotions and penetrate all the way to our physical body. But to some degree we do experience it. And we can take a few examples. When, for example, a person is practicing deep meditation, we find the person becomes almost automatically immune to the reactions of pain. And this is testable in laboratory. You can not only not be overwhelmed by pain, things being stuck, it hurts, but okay, I don't have my normal reaction of screaming. Even the biology reaction at the level of the tissue is less. You don't bleed as much, strangely. And for this, you don't even need to go all the way to spirit. You can even experience this in states of hypnosis, which is a very superficial and partial interiorization of consciousness. So under hypnosis, even without placing a separate suggestion, a person could stick a pin into your skin and you may not feel pain at all, and there would be very little blood or no blood at all, and the healing would be very rapid. Or even under hypnosis you can be told this part is completely numb and you can go through an entire process of surgery with minimum bleeding and very rapid recovery, not requiring any external anesthetic. Now the biological responses actually are changed by the fact that your consciousness was sufficiently interiorized. Recognizing this, now we're taking these are abnormal conditions. Recognizing this truth, you will find you can actually have similar results without needing to go into those abnormal states. For example, if you are told, well, I'm going to now place some pain on your finger. If you know there's going to be a certain discomfort, you can prime yourself to not have an instant reaction. During Christmas times in the ashram theatre, they used to have this challenge where they would put a coin inside a bowl of water and electrify the water. And the challenge was to put your hand in and take out the coin. And the moment you put your hand in, because of the electricity, your muscles cramp. Your fist closes, so you can't pick up the coin. You take it out and your hand is free. You put it back, it just closes, clams up. So we had, it was a bit of a challenge, and I said, well, I must overcome this. And I put my hand, of course it clams up. And then with intense concentration, I was able to push against until the hand opened and it gripped the coin and pulled it out. And the fellow who was controlling it, he saw that I was succeeding and he turned up the juice, increased the voltage. And I would find my hand pushed back and again pushing against. And so we had a discussion about it. He said he never had to push it that far. What was the difference compared to what others were doing and what I was doing? I was feeling inside my hand, feeling the energy or the instinctive response of the muscles, and then somehow pushing back. The consciousness entering in was able to seize on the electrical functions and modify something. Now, if the whole thing had been measured in a biological way, you might have said, well, the brain was sending extra electricity to counter the other electricity. I don't know. What physically it did is not important. What happened in terms of consciousness is important. Your consciousness penetrating inside is somehow able to seize upon the body and actually modify somehow momentarily. It withdraws and the body falls back to its old habit, instinct, reaction. Now, if you think about this process, you realize it's really at the heart of all learning of physical skill. If you find yourself learning to play the piano, at first your fingers don't move as you want them to. What do? You put more attention on the finger and consciously move with that extra intensified awareness. And then bit by bit you withdraw your awareness until the finger gets it, and then after that it moves automatically. You see what happened there? Your consciousness of mind awareness entered the body consciousness, modified, imprinted the modification, and then gradually withdrew until the new rhythm was set in the biology. And a link formed to the mind awareness. And this link is extremely important. The link formed now allows the mind to change intention and the finger follows. My mind chooses to drink water, the finger follows without needing to look. But a child who's 1 year old cannot do that. The 1 year old child needs to look and he has to somehow hold, afraid to slip. There are lots of gaps in between in the integration of the mind awareness with the hand awareness. But once that integration is made, it's automatic. And when you need to develop a new skill to juggle balls, for example, you will again infuse that extra awareness and modify. Now, if your mind has that much extra possibility to reshape and impose a greater freedom in the biology, certainly a power greater than mind can do far more. Spirit can not only shape mind, shape the emotional being, but reshape even the biology. Yes, there will be pushback, there will be resistance, there will be atavism, tendency of the body to go back to its old habit. But spirit has the ability to enter and modify, and eventually to ensure the modification becomes the new norm. How far can this go? Not only in skill of muscular coordination, but even in the body's internal regeneration. A cut will heal faster because of this infused mind awareness or spiritual awareness. How far can it go? The cellular regeneration can be further modified by this infusion of the higher consciousness. And this is the basis for so many miracles of healing. We have one of the most dramatic which comes to mind is of a person who had a fall and had multiple fractures of his leg. That was so bad he had to be taken then to Chennai. then Madras. The doctors put his leg in a plaster. He was brought back to Pondicherry. And the doctors said at least a few months before they can remove the plaster. I think they said 6 months. And mother gave him the instruction that he was to be brought when she was playing tennis in the tennis ground. He was to be brought on the wheelchair and made to go around the tennis court while she was playing. Very specific instructions. And so they did that. And after about a month, he was taken to Chennai for some checkup. And the doctors were astonished at the healing. They said, this is simply not possible. What should have happened over 6 months has happened within a month. What's your secret? The man said, I've just followed your instructions. I did nothing. And they insisted that it could not be, because they'd never seen such a dramatic improvement. So finally, they figured out that he was coming from the ashram, and then he mentioned that this is what the mother had instructed. The doctors were so astonished, they actually came to Pondicherry to meet the mother, to see who is this person. We have, of course, other examples where the mother placed her feet or her hand on specific cases and there were miraculous recoveries. One of them, I believe, was a sadhak who was about to die, and he said his last wish was to be taken to the mother on a stretcher, and he said, Mother, please place your one foot on my chest. I think he had a heart problem or something. And mother complied, she placed 1 foot. And not only the fellow recovered, he was hale and hearty for many years after, decades I believe. And he would joke for the rest of his life, see, 1 foot of the mother on my chest and I was cured. Imagine if she had placed both feet. These kinds of intervention not only demonstrate what is possible, but what must become the norm, not from an external spiritual consciousness intervening, but from our own awakening into spirit and thereby changing our relationship with the whole of our personal nature, all the way down to the body, down to the very working of each cell, and a change at the level of the cells working to a degree that the cells themselves now enter in relation with spirit and live no more by their old habit but by the will of the spirit at each moment, would be what Sri Aurobindo has described as the physical transformation, where the entire body consciousness down to the cells is now directly pliant to and expressive of the spirit. But what you're seeing here implies all these possibilities, although the discussion is on a very general level of the relationship of soul and nature. So, therefore, in proportion as the soul assumes its divine or spiritual being, it assumes also control of the movements of its nature. So, in one word, nature, he has spanned all these different levels. It becomes, in the ancient language, Swarat. The root sounds in Sanskrit, Swa of self, Rat, ruler, Lord. So Swarat, free and a self-ruler over the kingdom of its own life and being. Now the moment Sri Aurobindo throws in a word like this, there is a whole association to traditional knowledge, systems, sometimes texts, which have used that key phrase. And in this case, we are reminded of the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna explains how before you can be Samrat, that is Lord over the world, you must have self-mastery and become Swarat, Lord over your own nature. And so Sri Aurobindo, referring to this term, is giving you the key. Through this mastery over individual self, you will eventually gain mastery over all nature, universal nature. And so this comes in the next sentence. But also it increases in control over its environment, its world. For the moment, it's only a question of increase of control. Here you may grow immensely in your own personal nature, in mastery, but it reflects now or extends into your domain of immediate space, increase of control over environment and its world, whatever that size of its world may be. Its world may be your little space here, it may be much larger also. How does one do that? And now comes the next stage of the effort one has to make. This it can only do by universalizing itself. For it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. So how do you extend this self-rule to all rule? Your little consciousness must now widen to the all consciousness, universalizing itself. And the logic is, it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. Remember what's happening in the world. In universal nature, it is that divine will and divine knowledge working. Increasingly, as your consciousness now widens into universality and shares in and becomes a part of the movement of the divine will and divine knowledge, well, you share in and participate in that divine mastery of the environment and the world. So here comes now the steps. It must first extend its consciousness and see the universe in itself, instead of being like the mind, limited by the physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook of the little divided personality. I'll read the whole thing when we come back. It must accept the world truths, the world energies, the world tendencies, the world purposes as its own, instead of clinging to its own intellectual ideas, desires and endeavors, preferences, objects, intentions, impulses. These, so far as they remain, must be harmonized with the universal. And then after that, one more step. It must then submit its knowledge and will at their very source to the divine knowledge and divine will, and so arrive through submission at emergence, losing its personal light in the divine light and its personal initiative in the divine initiative. Now at that point you have reached a status where everything which was part of the cosmic working is now shared in your working, and your individual inclinations and interests are aligned to the cosmic working. And at that point, what would be the practical result? Such a being, such a person, whatever he chooses, whatever he wills, will be literally an action in the cosmos. And what can that be like? And we have before us the example of Sri Aurobindo, where we see in his diary notes in the record of yoga the stages of ascent in his own consciousness, in his sadhana, until he reached not only this but many other more profound realizations. And I will read from some letters in which he discusses something of this. Here is one of the very early letters. What I am attempting, Sri Aurobindo writes, is to establish the normal working of the siddhis in life, the perception of thought, feelings and happenings of other beings and in other places throughout the world, without any use of information by speech or any other data. So being aware of all these things happening without needing external means. Second, the communication of the ideas and feelings I select to others, individuals, groups, nations, by mere transmission of willpower. So that means he chooses an idea or a feeling and can direct it to an individual or a group of people or even a nation by willpower directly. Third, the silent compulsion on them to act according to these communicated ideas and feelings. Now once this is communicated, he can put an intention that they feel compelled now to act. Not only they feel an idea, not only they catch the feeling, but now they are compelled to act to fulfill those. Fourth, the determining of events, actions and results of actions throughout the world by pure silent willpower. you actually determine what will be the outcome of their efforts. And remember, it's not one person, there are 100 people working with conflicting, contradictory efforts. Can you will a specific outcome? And this is one of the objects. By pure silent willpower, nothing need be spoken, no one will ever know, but because that will was released, it compelled this specific outcome. And then Sri Aurobindo continues, when I wrote to you last, I had begun the general application of these powers which God has been developing in me for the last 2 or 3 years. This is at a very early stage of his sadhana, remember. But as I told you, I was getting badly beaten. This is no longer the case. For in the first, second, and even in the third, I am now largely successful. That means he is able to implant ideas and will them to be executed. Although the action of these powers is not yet perfectly organized, it is only in the fourth that I feel a serious resistance. This is January of 1913. And he had begun his yoga in this way at least 1909, let's say. So 3 or 4 years down. 1914, he is stabilized now in the supramental consciousness, and the whole thing has, of course, a very different character. We see from the record of yoga that even in the fourth degree, he is able to act now as necessary. And it's another letter where Sri Aurobindo writes in the third person, where he is describing how he acts on circumstances. The retirement from political activity did not mean, as most people supposed, that he had retired into some height of spiritual experience devoid of any further interest in the world or in the fate of India. In his retirement, Sri Aurobindo kept a close watch on all that was happening in the world and in India, and actively intervened whenever necessary, but solely with a spiritual force and silent spiritual action. Now, when he says this, kept a close watch on all that was happening in the world, people would think, oh, every day he must be reading newspapers, reading magazines, he must be subscribing to many things. No, remember the first siddhi which he refers to was knowing what's happening out there without physical means of communication. So when he says that he was keeping a close watch, now close watch means in detail, sensing, knowing, and when one extends in this way, particularly through the universal consciousness, the first thing that you receive as impression is thought, and then emotion, and then physical circumstances. To access the physical circumstances is most difficult because your primary reception is often on the higher levels, and it is through them that you are able to access the physical details. But in his case, the full development had taken place to whatever extent he needed to know, and actively intervened whenever necessary, solely with a spiritual force and silent spiritual action. For it is part of the experience of those who have advanced far in yoga that besides the ordinary forces and activities of the mind and life and body in matter, there are other forces and powers that can act and do act from behind and from above. Again, fine distinction from behind and from above. What does that mean? So behind is when you're acting from the inner mind or inner vital. Inside the person, let's say, or in a group or in a certain space, on an inner level, but at the level of the mind, there is a push of an idea or an intention placed. And from above, from the spiritual consciousness, something enters and drops down into the mind or vital, or acts as a pressure which provokes a response in the mind or vital. But they are completely different levels of working. There is also a spiritual dynamic power which can be possessed by those who are advanced in the spiritual consciousness, though all do not care to possess, or possessing it, to use it. And this power is greater than any other and more effective. And this is something very specific, which is what he calls spiritual dynamic power. And this means literally a power of the divine Shakti which is brought down, and it could be from any of the higher levels, including the supramental, which can be brought down and then dropped on a situation. The mother speaks of this in the agenda, where she speaks of how Sri Aurobindo used very selectively the action of the supramental consciousness in the physical world, primarily because on the physical world there are, of course its action is miraculous, so in the physical world there are often reactions or resistances which may sometimes distort. But in the vital and mental world he used it frequently. And she describes how he would bring a drop of the supramental consciousness and place it on a situation, and suddenly the whole situation would ripple out and be changed. And she describes the characteristics of the supramental action in this case. First, that it would happen on a large scale, because the supramind is a consciousness of infinity. Its impact also is on a large scale. Second, it was miraculous. What is miracle? Instead of following obvious sequence of steps, it jumps the sequence. So if it was obvious sequence of steps, you would say, oh yeah, that was a natural result of whatever was. But when it jumps the step, you say, how did it happen? Miracle. Okay, the supermind is able to jump those steps and compel an outcome by using the existing machinery which is there. And so there's the second characteristics. And the third characteristic was, although it is miraculous leap, it seems so obvious, so natural that you don't realize it's a miracle. And a good example of this was in the way the Soviet Union broke down, and overnight everything had changed. And just the day before, all the same machinery which had held it in compression for decades, everything was operating exactly as it was. I recall at that time reading an article that in Romania, the degree of the police state was so deeply rooted that every third person was a government informer. Now in a family of 5, that would mean 2 people at least were government informers. Nobody dared to speak against whatever was the imposed belief system. How can such an entrenched system ever break down? But when it did happen, overnight it happened, and suddenly the whole thing was free. And for a moment people blinked, and then rather than saying miracle, they said, okay, move on, you just accept. But it was so natural and spontaneous. But this is the specific character of the supramental action. Here he is not specifying which one it is that he is referring to. And we'll complete this passage. And this power is greater than any other and more effective. It was this force which, as soon as he had attained to it, he used. At first only in a limited field of personal work, but afterwards in a constant action upon the world forces. He had no reason to be dissatisfied with the results or to feel the necessity of any other kind of action. Now, this is a very humble way of saying that he had complete success. No reason to be dissatisfied, meaning you have full satisfying result. And so this gives you an indication of what is possible and the scope to which what he is describing here can grow to. So now let's look at the finer steps of this whole process of universalizing and aligning to the higher working, and to what extent we can apply it today as we are in our life. So let's look at it first from a personal perspective of what we can do and what we can experience. First he says, this it can only do by universalizing itself, for it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. So if we have to widen our consciousness to express a divine and universal will, then our consciousness has to at least begin to turn to or approach something of that universality, of that divine will and action. So what is required? it must first extend its consciousness. How far does this go? And see the universe in itself, instead of being like the mind limited in the little divided personality. So the contrast is with what we are, little divided personality and limited outlook, and he lists all the levels of the outlook of limitation. Instead of being like the mind limited by the physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook of the little divided personality. Now you notice here he has bothered to name all these levels. Where earlier he just said movements of nature. He could have said limited outlook of our nature. No, when he points out many levels like this, it's because on each of these levels now you have to introspect and observe. Where is this limitation? What is it doing to you? In what way is it keeping you narrow? On each of these levels. So it won't be enough if in your mind you widened your outlook. You will find that although your mind is widened, there is still the same tendency in your emotional nature. Your emotions becoming more wide and embracing, your sensational nature is still bound to littleness. And the vitality of your nature, and then the physical body itself as the limit of your sense of I. Each of these levels brings its own limitation, and each of them separately operating create for a fragmented individual. Now on each of these levels we have to widen, and you'll see in the next sentence he describes all those levels of, the result of all those levels of widening when he speaks of world truths, which would correspond to the mind, world energies, which correspond to the vitality within you, the world tendencies and world purposes. All these have to become yours, or the part in you that has a distinct personal need aligns at least to those. So we'll see what this means now. So first, extend its consciousness. How do we do that? You notice you're doing this all the time unconsciously. Every time that you have a space within which to work, your consciousness expands to include that space in the working. When you are interacting with a group of people, especially if you're in a position of leadership and responsibility, then somehow a part of you joins with all of them. The team is an extension of yourself. And if it is not, you cannot be in a smooth interchange with them. How far can this go? Your family, your immediate biological, physical family, your immediate emotional family may be slightly larger. It includes my nieces and nephews and grandparents or good friends going back 20 or 30 years. And that's still my extension of emotional being. But these are partial, they are temporary, they come in, they go. But can I consciously extend to include these as myself? Now there are two tendencies in which this can be done. One where I aggrandize myself to seize and take into me, all these people are me, and therefore implied they should do what I want. You will see this often in certain families where there's a patriarch who's very dominating. And literally the person orders everybody around, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, until people find it suffocating. Not realizing what has happened is his narrow personal ego has seized on this larger identity and tried to squeeze it into his narrow template of his nature. But the right way would be simply to recognize this is all part of me, not needing to seize. But the easier way is to do it the other way. Recognize there is this wide universe of which I am a part, and then gently open myself to the wideness of my own higher part, which is the universe. Or look at it this way. You are this narrow little personality, ego, person on the lower level in relation with nature. In you, above you, is your own spirit, your own self, which is above nature and master of things. And you open and give yourself to your own self, to the divine. it's a question, not just a question of vocabulary, it also changes the nature of the experience. You can open to your own self, you can open to the divine Shakti, the divine mother, and the character of the experience is different. In the integral yoga, the easiest approach is to feel oneself as a child of the divine mother and to open oneself to her embrace, and in doing so, dissolve the boundary of our littleness in receiving her wideness in the embrace. And it's as if she draws you into her wideness and you begin to share in her totality. There is no sense of the ego aggrandizing, claiming and becoming large. There is rather the joyous self-giving into her wideness. This is the most safe, least likely to be seized upon by the ego sense, but effectively it has the result of widening and universalizing you. Now you can look at this happening on each of the levels that we have described. So, it must first extend its consciousness, and it goes as far as see the universe in itself. And that's the limit to which you will experience everything is your own larger reality. Now observe how this happens on many levels. He is described not be limited by physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook. So let's go the reverse way, the mind. And it's easiest to start with this. The mind now recognizes I am not cut off from the universe. Everything happening within me is in continuous relation and interchange with all the energies of the universe. And to think that I am separate is an illusion. To think that I am a part of the whole is the way. All ideas belong in this space. All ideas have their validity. All viewpoints are justified in the totality. Mine is only one narrow viewpoint. And any other viewpoint that comes I can accept as equally valid and then find a higher reconciliation in something which is more valid than both. And so one begins a culturing of the intellectual outlook. In the emotions, similarly, one can change the relationship rather than seeing things as separate. Begin with the sense of the divine presence in all things and the love towards the divine that lives in all things. Or it can extend in a general way to the idea that you love the one divine presence that flows and fills everything. How wide is its flow? As vast as the universe. And so something of the heart's emotional outreach extends, expands and joins with that whole. You have no more the sense that I am cut off, those are mine, those are not mine. Everything is part of a larger relationship with that divinity, and of course it takes various colors and degrees of responsibility everywhere. And then you meet a stranger on the road and you are able to express the same spontaneous affection that you would to your own child or to your own parent, because it is equivalent. It is as much your child or your parent or yourself even in a different body. And this becomes a different level of cultivation of the heart, of the emotions. Then there is the sensational limitation. And this is the part where we look at the world through our senses, and your senses only go so far. I can touch only within this spread of half a meter where my hands can go. Beyond that, I hear and I see. But can you extend beyond that and not just look from your little perspective of looking from here? And in the senses, you begin to realize the bee experiencing the universe is as valid or as complete as I looking at the universe, which includes the bee. And every viewpoint. And in this way, some part of your sensational consciousness widens, includes. But it takes its most complete form when in the touch you feel and perceive the other as the same one divine presence or yourself in everything. And that brings it to a level very close to the physical body consciousness also. Literally, as you touch the flower, you feel the flower was yourself, and you touched yourself like this. And there's not much difference between the two. Then he puts the vital and the physical after this, because the life energies are the ones where the knot of the ego sense, the sense of separation, is most deeply rooted. The physical gives to it the most concrete form of appearance. But the knot, he explains, is in the vital. And so in the energy, life energy itself, one gradually begins to loosen, feel the flow of energy across, not only in relation to things and people, but starting with the conception. If you have worked on these higher parts, this becomes relatively easy. You recognize the energy coming into you from this immediate one step beside you actually originated all the way to the other end of the universe. And in the energy, one begins to feel a sense of wideness and universality. When that happens, literally one feels as if a gate has opened up, and you feel the continuity of the whole ocean of universal energy. You are not even like a bubble in it, you are almost like a part that is artificially identified as being more conscious, but it is a continuum. You cannot separate anymore. And it's often in this part, because this is not so clearly felt consciously, at first there is a resistance, or the mind dwells upon it more, and then suddenly there's a breakthrough and it just opens up. The mother speaks of this. When she was working on her consciousness, she had found a layer of awareness which was unconscious. And it had to do with a particular quality which is very close to the energy felt in plants and in nature. And she said she was working on it in a sustained way. It seemed as if nothing was happening. And then one day she happened to go on a weekend into the countryside, and she lay down in the garden, and suddenly the whole thing released, and that part layer opened up, and it was bridged. The work was done. But there's something of this character to the push of the vital universalizing, and then the physical consciousness. One culminates in this body to the degree that this body and this table feel equivalent in terms of physical substance. Of course, I have sensation here, I have less sensation there, but they are equally me. And one experiences the body itself as part of the continuum. All the food coming in and all the waste going out, and everything is felt as a continuity. Now, none of these need to be taken all the way to completion. Just the fact that a little bit has been widened is already enough to make you a receptacle for a higher action, which then you become more conscious of, and the working of this freer poise of the soul becomes more and more spontaneous. You will find within your personal nature and in your immediate environment, things tend to begin to fall into place spontaneously. One of the things which happens to everybody as they take to spiritual life, because this kind of an opening begins already on some level, one of the things we all notice is coincidences. You wish to know something and spontaneously a book opens, somebody reads out, or a text you found while walking by on the railway station triggers the insight that you needed. It comes out of the blue. You want to meet somebody and suddenly the phone call comes, or you find that person right there. Something is required. I remember one of the most dramatic. I was writing a series of articles on science in Sri Aurobindo, and I had taken up the theme of homeopathy. And I had an intuition that there was something which I needed, which was to do with the nature of water. At that point, I happened to be traveling in another country in Europe, staying with someone. I would never go out because I had a very specific purpose. I stayed within that. And my host offered to take me out. I never asked for it. On the way, we found a bookstore. We walked into it, and because I love books, I looked around. My eyes were browsing here. My right hand went and picked a book from below, And I went to see what is it, and as I opened it, it fell on a page which had a description of the structure of water, exactly what I needed. And then I scanned through the whole book. All the rest was unnecessary, just that one page was what I needed. I bought the book, of course, for that one page. But how does that happen? How do you even explain it? But when it happens, it feels so natural. One expects it almost after a while. But these things start happening because in some deeper layers our consciousness now begins to open up, widening, not yet universalizing, but the process of universalizing has begun, and that allows the higher working now to operate more freely because it creates a wider space of engagement, removing the narrow barricades which locked in your little personality. So when we study this, yes, he has set up the frame where it must go all the way in which you experience the whole universe within yourself. But every little step is a joyous widening and freeing up from our narrowness and leads to this small shift. The next thing, it must accept the world truths, the world energies, the world tendencies, the world purpose as its own, instead of clinging to its own intellectual ideas, desires, endeavors, preferences, objects, intentions, impulses. Now the full list describes all the things which are within you as defining your personal interests and drives from the little egocentric personality. Instead, now we accept what is from outside, from the divine, the world truth, world energy, world tendency, world purpose. What is that? And you could observe on each of these levels, but we'll just take the broad idea. What's the world tendency? Growth, forward movement, integration, greater harmony, greater love, greater mutuality, greater self-giving. What is the world energy doing? Pushing forward to fulfill these things, to assist in the forward progress. What are the world truths? These deeper and higher things of which we are reading, which we find so much joy in. The sense of your true being, who you actually are, who's living across lives, and the sense of purpose which is in there. And what is world purpose? Or your individual purpose. Everything is moving forward in the evolution. You as an individual are moving forward in this evolution. And if you accept the world purpose, you discover everything within you is finally actually fulfilling that. And so you consciously now begin to align this to the world purpose. All your energies, where are you putting your effort? I want to put a lot of effort to make a lot of money, to acquire fame, to create security for myself, to build a house, to buy a car. No. What's the world purpose? Growth of plenitude, growth of strength, growth of knowledge, in which of course is implied growth of security. And then what I do then, I align to that purpose. Yes, for that overall growth, I must create a framework in matter which creates a space of security. If that means building a separate house, all right. If it doesn't require a separate house, I work it within the current framework. But I am not making it for myself to satisfy my insecurity. I am doing it to fulfill a larger purpose in evolution. I want to study and grow to master knowledge. I could do it for myself to get a diploma, to get my job. Or I could do it because that's the deepest impulse in the world's fulfillment and in my fulfillment, to grow in knowledge. I may or may not get the diploma, or I may choose to not get it because it doesn't matter, or I may choose to get it because it's useful in a larger fulfillment of the world purpose. And if you start thinking in these terms, you will find already all the impulses within you are intended to serve world purpose. But the difference was you directed them to fulfill your personal insecurities, intellectual ideas, desires, endeavors, preferences, objects, intentions, impulses. Now you redirect them to that larger world truth, world energy, world tendencies, world purposes. And in this way, when you start reshaping, you will find suddenly you are no more obsessed with your own problems. You're serving something much larger than yourself, and you're carried by the full force of that large movement. And it happens, it is inevitable, it is certain, because it is the whole ocean flowing, not your little eddy of a little piece struggling against the ocean. You're going with the larger flow. And yet within it, you have a complete fulfillment of all your personal needs. And a few things which may be very specific. In my case, I may find that I want to play the violin, or I find great joy in playing the violin. Suppose that is the specific requirement. He says, these, insofar as they remain, must be harmonized with the universal. So I say, all right, this is particular to my nature. I have that impulse or that desire, but what do I play the violin for? How do I learn to play it, and I align it to this larger movement of evolution? Again, a simple way to do it is to consecrate it to the divine. You do not need then to make a specific understanding of what this movement is. Whatever you choose, I offer to you, and let this be a part of your working. Or it can broaden to recognizing the larger working and then making a conscious consecration and orientation. What do you live for? Think about it. What are you dedicating your life to? And go through a process of introspection and realigning, correcting, removing it from a very narrow personal momentary satisfaction or survival instinct to something larger, which is so much more fulfilling. Now, he's made a long list. You can dwell on each of these. What are your intellectual ideas which limit you? And can you align them to the larger world's truths? What are the desires and endeavors that you have? Can you align them to the larger world energy? What are the preferences and objects, intentions and impulses? Align them to the larger world purpose. And go through a deep process of introspection over time, over a few weeks, months, years. Perhaps it goes on. Wherever you find something is too narrowly personal, broaden it, include it in the larger, and still you have the personal fulfillment because it's aligned, harmonized with the universal. And when this becomes wider, more complete, at the very source, a shift comes. It must then submit its knowledge and will at their very source to the divine knowledge and the divine will. And so arrive through submission at emergence. You merge in with the divine knowledge and the divine will. Now again, all of these need not be in sequence one after another. They can also be simultaneous to the degree currently possible. Whatever knowledge, whatever will, I consciously open and offer and seek an intuitive inspiration to guide. But it's not so effective to begin with if you have not already awakened to some concrete relation with the divine knowledge, feeling the divine will. When that grows, then this change becomes more obvious, more easy. And that's why he keeps it for the last. As the universalizing on these levels begins, you will begin to sense the flow of the universal purpose. You will sense, but the purpose is moving now in this direction. That's what the divine energy is intending. And you'll align yourself to that, but you're feeling it. And because you're feeling it now, you can align your personal will to that will. And so each step here automatically opens you to the awareness which makes the next step possible. Let's reread this and then use it as a framework for a basic reorienting or practice in our lives. The increased control over environment and its world. So, but spirit is in possession of knowledge and will, of which it is the source and cause and not a subject. Therefore, in proportion as the soul assumes its divine or spiritual being, it assumes also control of the movement of its nature. as it increases in control over its environment but it also increases in control over its environment and its world. This it can only do by universalizing itself. For it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. It must first extend its consciousness and see the universe in itself, instead of being like the mind, limited by the physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook of the little divided personality. So on all of these levels, it must accept the world truths, the world energies, the world tendencies, the world purposes as its own, instead of clinging to its own intellectual ideas, desires, endeavors, preferences, objects, intentions, impulses. These, so far as they remain, must be harmonized with the universal. It must then submit its knowledge and will at their very source to the divine knowledge and the divine will, and so arrive through submission at emergence, losing its personal light in the divine light and its personal initiative in the divine initiative. And so this is a broad framework, and you can see how one can even view it as a work of many years, maybe even a lifetime, depending on what pace one works at. But it is an aspect of the work which will be automatically supported by other things happening. As your consciousness deepens and heightens, all of this now becomes more spontaneous, more direct, more complete, effortless even. As the higher presence of the divine and its wideness settles in your mind, it liberates and widens automatically. As it settles in your energies and in your body, it does this work automatically. So there are two things which will happen. There will be a movement of little efforts that you make, and then something from above which will fill into your personal efforts and add to it something much more, almost spontaneously. And that's how the yoga actually takes place in this case, in the integral yoga, where the divine Shakti fills your personal effort and gives to it an outcome far greater than you could of your own. But if you invoke and submit consciously to that. The result, and we read the last line of this paragraph. In summary, what is to be done? To be first in tune with the infinite, in harmony with the divine, and then to be unified with the infinite, taken into the divine, is its condition of perfect strength and mastery. And this is precisely the very nature of the spiritual life and the spiritual existence. So, first you enter in tune, and then as a result, into unity. And this becomes the secret of perfect strength and mastery, not just within your own nature, but in the larger world nature. But this is also, he says, precisely the very nature of the spiritual life and the spiritual existence into which you are growing. And so here we find a practical, in summary, resolution of how the soul can attain to perfect harmony with nature, no more now dominated by nature and her limited capacity, but now is living in a freedom and thereby flowing freely as nature and wielding the full power of nature as its own power in mastery and freedom at the same time with full strength, no limitation. Now this is the broad framework. How is this to happen in fine steps? What are the various relationships that the soul has with nature as it climbs up? This becomes the theme of the next few paragraphs, where he describes how the Purusha can be in a state of witness, it can be upholder, source of the sanction, the knower, the Lord, and the enjoyer. So each of these are facets and degrees, so to say, of the relationship with nature, which we will take up next time, next Friday. We can pause briefly for any questions.
marrying, with children, and get a house. Sometimes you have asked why am I doing all this? So, like the broader framework connecting to the finances, and also things like your first influence can be your family, then the latter.
Yes.
So, when Panditji talks about this daily framework of therapy, how can we do that with regard to where we are? Like IT, you work for Universalizing.
Yes.
Directly contributing there.
A simple exercise which will already begin this reorientation can be done at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. In between, you are too preoccupied to do anything else. But in the beginning of the day, you can poise yourself on whatever deepest or highest state of consciousness you can arrive at, with the effort possible given the time that you have. So everybody has a routine where you at least have a shower or a breakfast. Well, include in that a brief moment of concentration or a degree of interiorization. It can be done with external form of prayer or in silence, doesn't matter. But a shifting of the state of consciousness to whatever deepest or highest you can reach, or at the very least a deepening of contact of relationship with the divine presence, whatever form. That itself will change the whole relationship of your consciousness with your personal nature, your environment and your work. The quality of your day will be completely different just by having done that. Of course, if you can, in the middle of the day, you may also try to remember that and resettle yourself into that whatever degree possible, deeper or higher, while in the midst of activity. Certainly that will help to whatever extent you can do it. But at the end of the day again, when you come back, maybe when everything is over, you review the whole day. Put yourself in a deeper or higher poise and review the whole day. And from that higher and deeper poise, you will suddenly see everything in different value. Many things to which you gave a lot of energy and time, you may find from your higher poise that was not so useful. Something else feels, this is much more worthwhile. And you simply observe. And over a few days, automatically you'll find in the midst of the activity, there will be an inclination, a tendency to increase those things which are worthwhile, to reduce those things. And over time, automatically, a rearrangement will take place of your day. You will not be struggling. It will just be a shift of interests spontaneously happening. But by the very fact that you made a conscious awareness from a deeper or higher poise at the end of the day. But then you complete that exercise. Having viewed the whole day, you take all that effort. Now view it in the larger context of the journey, of your own spiritual journey across lives. Simply the idea that I'm in the midst of this larger journey of evolution, of awakening, of growth, of perfection, of divinization, of awakening, whatever form it is. And then which is itself a part of a larger universal movement, which is all an expression of the Divine Mother, of the divine will, of the divine manifestation. Whatever to you feels the most close to the heart, as an idea or as a feeling or as an experience. You put yourself in relation to that larger movement and offer the whole day, asking for it to be made a part of that movement, that this may be one step in that larger movement. Simply that placed as an idea, as an offering, and then go to sleep. So setting yourself these two movements at the beginning and end of the day, it sets a context in which everything in the day will begin to change, and very rapidly. You will notice down a few weeks or months, your way of thinking will have changed. The widening will take place automatically. Yes. 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 Unfortunately, in the way the current administrative structures are, whether in government or in private spaces, the priorities are very different, And sometimes you're asked to do things which you may not feel even aligned to your conscience or even to your common sense. And yet you have to do it, otherwise you're shunted out by the system. The thing to recognize in such a case is that you're part of a system which is already obsolete and in process of change. I'm putting it in a positive way. Some of it is in a process of being destroyed to be replaced by something else. But in any case, it's in a process of change. And to the extent you can exercise that small effort needed to assist the change. So if you're in a space which is conducive, you may even state a possible option. Yes, we could do this, but we could also consider this, which will be more advantageous, more beneficial to all, and in the long run. Propose ideas, attempt where possible to push the flexibility that is there. Where the system is too inflexible or pushes back hard, you have to accept a practical compromise and then call for the help. At least within you, you're conscious, well, I have to do this, but ask for the help, ask for the guidance, make an offering of this also, that although this to your common sense seems to be wrong, may it serve a larger purpose to fulfill the divine will. From the perspective of the supramental consciousness, even an opposing force is only an aspect of itself. So nothing can oppose it. It can use anything to hasten the progress. And so we put that prayer, put that intention, and we do what is required as best as we can. We can continue next Friday.